So hopefully you can see two logos on the screen that indicate the SPP and the Nature Biodiversity Peer Group. So welcome to you all. You are a wonderful mix of people across two initiatives today. So delighted to be hosting this session. Again, we're going to be about 40 minutes from now, so nice and punchy. But here today are a mixture of people from both the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, which is the logo on the left there, which is a community that I am very, very much supportive of and share the Champions program within. Which is the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, which is all about trying to capability build procurement to really make it easy to understand how to embed things like nature into their thinking, into their ways of working. And I also wear another hat, which is the Nature and Biodiversity Peer Group, which is those that are a bit more seasoned on nature and biodiversity as a topic, as much as you can be on this topic, because everyone's working it out as they go along, as I often say. So we're delighted to be welcoming those people here as well to learn a little bit more about what's happening in value chains. And delighted to have the TNFD with us today, and Tom's going to introduce us to what that is for those that don't know it. And really dive into what's been happening with value chains there. So whatever hat, whatever group, whatever community you're part of, you're all welcome in this session. We'll have a short intro from Marina, who leads and co-chairs the Nature chapter within the SPP. I'll explain a little bit more about the peer group, and then we'll let Tom explain a little bit more, and then we'll have plenty of Q&A, won't we? Because I know you've got plenty of things to say and share and questions to as part of this as well, I'm sure. Just want to cover antitrust, so important, but again, in this instance, I don't think hugely relevant, but it's important that we do it anyway. So just be conscious of everything that you're saying and sharing. Obviously, it's Chatham House rules, so again, just be aware of things that you're saying, and let's keep everything within this group. We are recording the session, and that'll be shared with the group, but as I said, just be conscious of what's happening and what you're sharing. And my rules are just get involved and definitely ask silly questions. We're all kind of really working out what nature means to us, especially in procurement. So feel free to ask silly questions. It's really important that everyone feels like it's something we can do and enjoy the session. That's probably the most important thing. So just a quick intro to the Nature and Biodiversity Peer Group. So for the last 10, 11 months or so, I've been building up a group of about 300 practitioners, mostly working on nature and with the nature role in a variety of different organisations. All of them realise the importance of engaging and involving procurement on nature in the supply chain. So that's a really key part of it. We all want faster and more confident action on nature and biodiversity to understand it better, to understand its relevance to business better, and to really understand what everyone else is doing. And it's been supported by GSK and Schneider Electric, two organisations that are very much trying to embed nature and nature thinking into their supply chains, and supported and funded the work from myself and my co-chair Melissa Miners as well, who may be on the call, to help deliver that programme of support. And it is free for everyone. Invite only for practitioners, but free for absolutely everyone. If you've got any questions about us or the group, you can go to naturepeergroup.com. You can find a lot more there, or you can message me in the chat. Okay, I think we'll go to Marina now. Marina, do you want to share a little bit about the SPP chapter?
Thank you very much. I'm 50% of the co-chairs of the SPP chapter of Nature and Biodiversity with my co-chair, Emma Howcroft. So the chapter of Sustainable Procurement Pledge focuses on nature and biodiversity, and we're really trying to speak to the procurement professionals in procurement language as to what they can do specifically within their space to integrate nature action into their work. And they may be operating, as you may yourselves be operating, in a space of having a strategy within the organization, maybe not having a strategy, but in either of those scenarios, there's still actions you can take. And that's the angle that we are trying to take, which is then supplementary and complementary to what Oliver has just talked about. So just a slightly different way to engage and provide you with tools, very practical examples, and hear from people who've done it themselves. So look forward to this conversation today as well.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent. And welcome to everyone. As I said, the most important thing we wanted to do with the Nature Peer Group and the Nature chapter was bring procurement and sustainability professionals together to not only work out what nature can do in value chains and should be doing in value chains, but also to work together and collaborate on. And that's why we run this joint session between initiatives. So you don't have to go to two meetings, you can just come to one. That's the idea. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Tom at TNFD. Tom will explain more about what TNFD is for those that don't know it. I know we've got plenty of seasoned nature professionals on the call, but we have got some procurement professionals here that probably are wondering what this is all about, but probably suitably intrigued. So for them, we'll probably do a short introduction to TNFD, and then we'll get into the great value chain work that they've been doing, and Tom will take us through. So thanks for jumping on, Tom. I appreciate it. And over to you, my friend.
No worries at all. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'll just bring the slides up on the screen.
And if you've got any questions for Tom at any point, please put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand. We're all friendly here, so we'll probably take more questions at the end and throughout, but I want lots of questions, please. I demand them. So over to you, Tom.
No problem. Just...
I had lots of problems sharing my slides as well.
No, it's I don't know why.
Got it.
Can you see? Is that full screen?
All looking good.
Oh, it is. Yeah, cool. Great. So my name is Tom Hegarty. I work in the TNFD Secretariat. The TNFD is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Institutions, and I'll explain a bit more about what that is in a moment. But first of all, to motivate the discussion a little bit, I'm going to talk about why nature is important and why it's important for your business. So on the left, we have a diagram that shows 9 what we call planetary boundaries, and these are 9 planetary systems that scientists have identified as important for sustaining life on Earth. And you can see that this in the middle, there's a picture of the globe, and that's the safe operating space. And you can see for 6 of those 9 planetary boundaries, we are well outside where the safe operating space is. And that means that whatever particular system you're looking at, so for example, just above, just to the left of the sort of 12 o'clock space, you've got climate change and like CO2 concentrations, as we know, well above what we need, where we need to be, but also just the declines in genetic variability, changes in land use, changes in freshwater use, flows of nitrogen and phosphorus, so like fertilizers, all well beyond where they need to be to keep the Earth in a stable system. And that is increasingly reflected in risk perceptions. So on the right, we've got the results of the World Economic Forum risk surveys. So they survey business and academic leaders from around the world, and you can see that 5 of the top 10 risks over the next 10 years that they've identified are environmental risks. So this is an increasingly important topic for you to start to think about, and it's going to have real impacts on your business. So obviously, extreme weather events can destroy infrastructure, increase costs, means that you can not have access to the natural resources you need. There's also sort of policy changes that will affect your business as governments try to adapt their policy frameworks to address some of these issues. And we have some of these risks are already starting to materialize. We've got some really great case studies that were developed by Bloomberg, in a document called When the Bee Stings, and I really encourage you to go have a look at that. It's available online. We've got 10 case studies that show how some of these changes in natural systems are already causing immediate financial costs to business. So these risks are materializing already, and so it's really important that we start to think about them in a more systemic way, to start to understand okay, how do we as a business depend on nature, and what impacts are we having, and what might that mean for us in the future? And the TNFD is here to help. So we are an initiative that is trying to support shift in global financial flows away from nature negative outcomes towards nature positive outcomes. And the way we do that is by supporting disclosure of corporate nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. So these are the dependencies and impacts you have on nature, and how that creates risks and opportunities for your business. We're a market-led initiative with the main governance body being a task force of 40 business representatives from financial institutions, corporates, and market service providers from every continent, representing a good chunk of global market capitalization and assets under management. But we're funded by governments, and we also have a network of knowledge partners who are sort of scientists and leading NGOs who help us make sure that what we're recommending is really robust and yeah, science-based. So we've produced a set of recommendations for how you as an organization can disclose to investors useful information about how your businesses depend on nature and what impacts you have. And we've also proposed a set of guidance that helps you identify that information, how you can proceed through analyzing your business to understand where are those nature-related issues. So here we've got on the left the recommended disclosures. These map very closely to the recommendations from the TCFD for climate. So we have the same 4 pillars: governance, strategy, risk and impact management, and metrics and targets. And we've copied across all of the TCFD disclosures, adapted slightly for nature. We've just added three new ones that are specific to nature. One about engagement with stakeholders in any particular location, because location is so important for nature, distinct from climate, where we think about, well, where you emit your greenhouse gas doesn't really matter. It has the same impact on the climate. For nature, location really matters. Is it, are you polluting this water body or another one? What are the species in this place or that place? Are you dependent on a forest that's protecting you from flood risk, or are you dependent on a water body that is supplying with you fresh water? So it's really important to think through location and who else is in that location, who's going to be affected by your activities, and who might be able to also be affecting your access to those natural resources. And then we have an additional disclosure as well under strategy D, which is a new one, which is about locations again. So where are your locations? Which natural ecosystems are you engaged, are you affecting or dependent on? And are those locations particularly sensitive? Are there any rare species? Is that ecosystem particularly precious to be protected? Or are you in a water stressed area? And then finally, in risk and impact management, so the third column, we've split out risk and impact management A, which is about how you're identifying your nature-related issues. And we split it into 2 parts, one about the direct operations and one about upstream and downstream value chains, which is important for the discussion today, because we recognize that it's quite challenging for nature to analyze your upstream and downstream value chains. Obviously, scope 3 for climate is already quite challenging. Companies are having lots of difficulty calculating what are their scope 3 emissions. And so we've given a bit of space here in the disclosures to explain how you've done that for nature. On the right, you can see this graphic that shows this 4 phases of what we call the LEAP approach. And this is our guidance for how you can assess your nature-related issues. Again, 4 phases. So starting off with locating all the businesses and activities in your value chain and whether those locations are sensitive, evaluating the dependencies and impacts at each of those places, assessing what risks and opportunities those create, and preparing to respond and report on what you found from that analysis. So we've got a whole suite of guidance. This is just the very peak of it, so the recommended disclosures then and the LEAP approach. And today I'm going to focus in on another document we've produced, which is thinking more specifically about value chains. But there's so much out there on our website. Please do take a look. We've got lots of materials that can help you start to think about nature, think about how it might affect a business, case studies, use cases, and sector guidance as well that can help you dive into particular issues that might be affecting your sector. So if there are no questions about TNFD in general, I'll dive into the value chain stuff.
Yeah,
so we produced, that changed, yeah, we go. We've produced this guidance on value chains. We put out a draft towards the end of last year and then had a consultation for a few months and then published a final guidance in the summer. But we've got 3 key messages from this guidance. So first of all, you are expected to, or the TNFD recommendations do include an expectation that you disclose all material dependencies, impacts, risks and opportunities along the whole value chain, so upstream and downstream. However, we recognise this is pretty challenging and that it's not always straightforward, and it might take some time to be able to fulfil that recommendation. So what we recommend is that organisations try and prioritise leading by what's most likely to be material for their business, rather than like degree of control or data availability. For the point of disclosure, identifying your risks and opportunities, dependencies and impacts, it's really about what is most likely to be a sort of substantial issue. And we recommend 5 steps. So first of all, clarifying the aims of the analysis, the intended users and their needs. So why are we doing this work? What do they need to know? that could be external users, but also internal. So your investors, they'll have certain needs, but also you might internally realize, oh, we really want to understand this particular nature-related issue. And so then once you've thought about what are we trying to achieve with this, you can then think about, well, what are the barriers that we're facing? And this is all should be, I'm sure it's quite obvious in a way, but so what are the barriers to doing this assessment upstream and downstream? I've just noticed there's an error on the slide, but don't worry. So you've got to prioritize issues for investigation and quantification. So once you've thought about what are the barriers, you're going to have to think about, well, how are we going to prioritize, therefore, across our value chain, balancing these needs and think about the barriers. Then work out what data you need to meet the needs of those users and determine what action is needed, and then identify what data you already have and therefore what gaps you need to fill and what can be covered adequately using secondary data. And I'm going to go into all of this in a bit more detail because I appreciate this is quite a high level at this stage. So we thought about what barriers there are to value chain analysis. So you're going to have long supply chain and distribution chains, large numbers of suppliers and customers. And for each of those, they might have large numbers of locations to analyze. Each product might have multiple end uses that mean that it's very hard to understand like what are the likely impacts or dependencies of that product. Similarly, what you buy might be a transformation, aggregation of multiple different products. Your value chain might well be changing constantly. If you're buying through a middleman, who's supplying that middleman might be changing all the time. So it's all pretty complicated to analyze, and there's loads of different barriers. So what we say is be really proportionate. So you've prioritized based on what's likely to be material. So choose something start with something small. Maybe you just choose one commodity that you're buying and try and analyze that in depth to learn and then expand over time. But also think about, well, what information do we need? Do we need to actually understand specifically the particular mine or particular farm where this has come from? Or are we happy that we can understand our dependencies and impacts, risk opportunities at a slightly more generic level based on regional averages? And that depends very much on the users and what you also want to do internally. So if you think you can identify sufficiently your risk opportunities based on regional averages and that's going to meet your investors' needs, then that's perfect. But also you might want to think internally, well, how do we want to respond to this nature-related issue that we've identified? Do we want to adopt a certification approach? So if you're buying agricultural commodities, maybe you can certify them, and therefore you might feel that's sufficient to have the confidence that is being produced in a sustainable way, and therefore it's going to be well managed, and you're sort of outsourcing the tracing in a sense. Or you might decide, well, actually, our organization wants to have a much higher level of control. We've got much less risk appetite. We want to know exactly which farm this has come from. And so you need to think about, well, what are we trying to achieve, and who are the users, both internally and externally. And so that will then depend. Do you just need to understand what country it's come from, which ecosystem, which particular landscape, or even which specific site? And you can see this continuum on the slide there. You'll also already be doing loads of work that's going to be super relevant to identify nature-related issues. I already mentioned Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, but human rights due diligence processes, modern slavery compliance, know your customer initiatives, all of these will be generating information that will be super useful for thinking about nature-related issues. If you just gather together all of the information we have, I'm sure like many businesses have already told us that actually they were really surprised and they had been very worried about doing this, but they found out they had quite a lot of information already. So that can also help you build a bit of confidence. Also important to think about for those points where you don't have data yet and you want to analyze that issue, you might want to use secondary data, so these regional averages that I mentioned. So we produced a few criteria for how to do that. So you need to think about, does this provide sufficient information for us and for the report users? And is it sort of disproportionately expensive to do sort of our own individual tracing or estimates? But what you need to think about is when you're choosing your data, is that data specific enough to give us the information that we need? Is it like if the data is like 10 years out of date and for a different place, that's probably not going to give you useful information. So you need to where possible, try and find data points that are at least geographically and spatially as precise as possible, even if it's a bit of an estimate, maybe an average across a bigger area. But recognize that's going to be challenging and have to be quite realistic about what that secondary data is telling you. So there's a lot of judgment involved here. There's a lot of trying to be proportionate, but also realistic about where you've sort of taken taken averages or used less detailed information. What does that mean for you, and how realistic can you be? How realistic can you describe your nature-related issues? So that's a very quick overview of the TNFD and our guidance on value chains, but very happy to have a bit of an open discussion about how this might apply in practice and hear your thoughts.
Excellent, Tom. Really appreciate that. Thanks so much. And that was pretty clear, even for me. So that's a good sign. We have got a bit of time. And Tom, I don't know, are you free until the hour? Because I might be bold enough to say that we might stick around for the extra 15 minutes than this meeting was arranged for, if anyone wants to. But
sure, we
I
can do that. Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. Because I think there might be more conversations. Great question from Charlotte. Charlotte, I don't know if you mind asking your question verbally rather than us reading it. Would you mind doing that? I think you're from
no,
Signify,
definitely.
I remember. Lighting
Yeah,
company.
exactly.
Used to be Philips Lighting back in the day, if I remember rightly. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Excellent.
it is.
Okay.
Can you hear me well? Yeah, okay.
We can hear you just fine. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I had a bit of a specific question, so I don't know if it's going a bit too more into details, but it's really about being able to prioritize the commodities to select which supplier you first want to engage with, and then how do you organize the different type of engagement, because each commodity might have more expected relevant impact, risk, and dependency. So I would just assume the approach might differ in how you engage with each, and then how do you create it in one cohesive cycle, which just seems like a very complex task to set together.
Yeah, well, as I was saying, it's important to take it step by step. We recommend taking a look at the SPTN high impact commodity list. So they publish a list of commodities that they've done some scientific review, like the scientific literature, and to identify which commodities are associated with the biggest impacts on nature. So that's worth having a look at when you're thinking about where to start. It's also, I mean, in terms of which suppliers to start to engage with, again, I'd sort of steer you to try and maybe do a bit of a screening of where, based on the information that you have about where they're operating and where they're getting their commodities. So if you know that some of them are operating in areas that are likely to be more ecologically sensitive, maybe they're in the Amazon rainforest, I mean, it depends obviously on the commodity, then that is probably something where you might want to start looking before somewhere that might be low risk. You might want to think about what are the governance arrangements, what are the regulatory arrangements in that location, that if you know where they operate, that might again give you a sense of the degree to which they're likely to be managing or not managing their nature-related issues, and therefore creating potential issues for your company.
Yeah. I know we've got plenty of experienced people on the call, so if anyone's got any other thoughts about Charlotte's question there, please do put your hand up or say, because I know that you will. Charlotte, I think that is, with your hand up. Hi, Charlotte.
Hi, it's actually Emma, Ollie. Sorry, I
Oh,
dialed
hi,
in
Emma.
as Charlotte. Sorry, guys, I had
That's
real
all right.
issue with internet this morning, so sorry for
That's
leaving you
fine.
all stranded.
That's right.
Sorry, just a quick question for Tom. Hi, Tom. Let me see if I can explain this properly, because you've got the EUDR in place, and obviously that provides a select number of commodities that are obviously high risk and also requiring regulatory monitoring, should we say. But I have found, sort of talking to people, that people sometimes zone in on these different commodities, even though they're not necessarily material in comparison to all the commodities in their supply chain. So I guess my question here is, do you think that's the right approach because they've been deemed high risk, and therefore, regardless of how material they are, one should get to grips with them? Or do you still think volume and quantity should still play a part here? because I think that's getting lost a little bit in translation, and we're kind of going down little rabbit holes going, this one's been highlighted, so I must look after this one. So it'd be great to get your view on what you think a balanced approach would be there.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a judgment that in the specific context you're operating in. So our guidance is very principles based, as you've just seen. So we're not very prescriptive in that sense. I would say that there's obviously a balance. Like if you're buying even a small amount of something that's known to be really, really bad, that's probably worth taking a look at. But also, if you're buying huge amounts of something that is relatively low impact, even if you're buying a lot of it, that might still, in aggregate, create an issue for your business, right? So it also depends a bit on your attitude to materiality, like what policy you're adopted internally. So when you're developing your reporting, you're gonna report all of your impacts, and are you trying to respond internally to all of your impacts, or you focus primarily on things that are creating financial risks for the organization? So it's also important to think about what are you as an organization trying to achieve with this. So sorry, a bit of a cop-out answer, but it depends a lot on what you're trying to achieve with your through the work from a TNFD perspective.
That's helpful, thank you.
I have to say, listening to all this, it all sounds very familiar with other issues in supply chains. It's an issue of data, it's an issue of traceability, it's an issue of prioritization and categorization criteria and all those sorts of things. Amazing how similar those things are. Stephanie.
Yes, hi everyone. Is the sound okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Cool. Thanks, Tom, for this this first high-level principles from TNFD on the value chain. And actually, you were actually mentioning some keywords, Oli, just now, like between traceability and transparency. And I would like just to make clear with you, Tom, I have my opinion and position for sure, but when you look into these principles and want to know more about the value chain, do you expect as TNFD to have a full traceability of all your tiers and have action at each level of your value chain? Or do you expect the organization to know the origin? So the farmland, as you were taking as an example, but could be the mining or the mine, it can be the refinery for the plastic production process. Because I think it's very important to clarify, and even more you as TNFD, because you're holding a framework that companies will follow, whether you're talking about traceability or transparency. In a business traceability, you have internal traceability within your own factory. Okay, when it comes in, it goes out. Okay, that's for security, regulatory perspective. It's let's say under the control and influence of the company. But then when you talk about traceability as well in a value chain, they would expect to know all the tiers. And then you have the spider web, going very broad on the planet itself, geographically speaking, in addition to the level of intermediaries, versus transparency, where you don't have to identify all your tiers, but you're very much encouraged and highly recommended to know the origin. And I think it's important for you, Guy, and TNFD to clarify what you are expecting here from a company developing TNFD measures or approaches in the value chain.
So I'd say we are definitely about from the typology you described, we're more on the transparency side. So we're saying take a proportionate approach. Think about what information you want in order to be able to have a sufficient understanding of your nature-related issues in the supply chain. That doesn't mean you have to know exactly where the items come from, but you need to have some understanding of what the likely issues are for that particular product. And that how you determine that proportionality will depend both on the cost and complexity of doing tracing, and also on the information needs that you have, and balancing. Well, and also actually the availability of secondary data. So it might be that the secondary data do not exist, and therefore you need to do more traceability in order to understand. But if you've got really great secondary data, you might decide actually we don't need to do the tracing because we're able to get a really good sense of what the issues are likely to be based on the data available. So, I mean, it is all of taking a judgment across these different dimensions, but we don't require that you trace everything back to the original origin.
Excellent. Your colleague Tom Charlie's made a good point in the chat about the way that certain matrices are used in order to understand and prioritize. If anyone on the call's using that sort of approach, it'd be good to hear from you as well. On that subject of secondary data, Claire Marie, do you want to maybe voice your question if you can?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I had a question. I mean, I'm in. Thank you very much, Tom, for your presentation. Sometime I'm wondering, you know, the use of secondary data versus the use of primary data, and I've taken one example because I thought it was a good illustration of that. That we can have primary data that is not, you know, the best to demonstrate the nature impact. So it was just, what is your view on that? I mean, you presented some other case where we can use secondary data and how to make sure they're robust enough. But what about the counter side, which is like what when primary data are not, you know,
so can you
providing
give
enough
a sort of
information?
concrete example of what that, so I understand where these, so you said the primary data might not be,
Well, for
it's like whether,
example, if you're thinking of a primary data that a supplier would share with you, whether it's on the carbon emission or on the water, they may have some element, but that are not allowing you to calculate, for example, land-driven emission, if it was to carbon or risk associated to water for water.
Sure. Yeah, so we didn't really consider that, but that's a really good point. So I guess that would fall into the point where you've not got the primary data, basically. You've got some information, but you're basically having to rely on secondary data. But maybe you could, I mean, you'd have to think about what analysis was possible based on the combination of data points, both secondary and primary. And maybe you could think about, well, based on this partial data, the supplier is a better or worse performer, and I don't know, you'd have to have a look at what was possible and form a bit of a judgment.
Hybrid,
but it's
more of an hybrid approach.
Yeah. But yeah, it would really depend on, because it's really tricky. But there's lots of data out there, and the data are ever better. And we're also TNFD developing some new initiatives around data sharing and trying to improve both the availability of data, how the data is made available, so that it's all a bit more consistent across space and the companies, so that you can identify data more quickly and that value chain partners share data in a more consistent way. And I'm very happy to. I mean, it's not my area so much, but I could point you to the documents that we have available on it.
Yeah, that would be. Thank you very much.
Again, lots of parallels here with Scope 3 as well, the need for that approach. And it's amazing how much we talk in the peer group about learning the lessons from Scope 3 and other issues as well for nature, so we don't end up making the same mistakes or slowing things down or taking ages to arrive at the same conclusions. There are differences, of course. But Kanishk, hi. Do you want to ask your question or make your comment?
Hi, Oli. Yeah, thanks, Tom, for sharing the perspective of the TNFD. 2 points, and slightly building upon what my colleague Stephanie asked a while back. The first question is, some of the scientific studies suggest that a lot of work which is done in parallel fields, such as climate change and others, do have a positive impact, or in fact, let's say climate change has the maximum impact in conserving biodiversity. Now, a lot of organizations are working on various initiatives by which they are contributing to certain extent on the climate issue. Methodologically speaking, is there any approach by which we can consolidate the impact, or kind of even think of trying to measure the impact which different climate measures are having on the biodiversity front. Now, I do realize here the complexity. I mean, it's not a very focused, narrow, but a very diffused kind of impact what we are talking about. But just talking from the science perspective, these two are, kind of looking at converging, and we don't know right now what is the methodology to, make that correlation. So, that's the first question. So, any thoughts on that? And the second question is what Stephanie was earlier mentioning: traceability versus transparency. Now, it is again sector dependent. For a lot of value chains which are dealing with commodities, traceability might be a challenge, because the nature of commodity is there is a spot market purchase, and you can't really trace across the tiers from the mine till you receive it in your factory gates. And if you are a downstream organization, the complexity only increases. Now, in this case, if someone wants to make let's say an intervention, there are two approaches that we've generally kind of we look at. One is, where the impact is, and you go in a very sharp, focused manner, and you make an intervention on the ground. On the other hand, if you do not know what is the route that is being taken, but you are using copper, and there are copper mines which are which are there, but you don't know which mine is contributing to your, or which smelter is contributing to your product. In that case, if we in general contribute to strengthening the voice for a greater ESG standards, across the copper mining sector, or other similar initiatives where we are part of the crowd to demand higher accountability, is that something which is recognized and can be quantified in terms of the efforts and the impact it's having? So these 2 points. Thank you.
Yeah, great points.
Sure. So the first one about climate and nature complementarities and trade-offs. So we definitely really support. So the first thing to say is this guidance is very focused on identification of nature-related issues rather than how you respond to those. So that's an important distinction that we built into when we were developing this. So we're very focused on this guidance is not about how you might manage your value chain. It's just about identifying and assessing issues. But having said that, climate nature complementarity is a really important issue. We're really keen that people try and integrate their efforts. So the TNFD, as I showed, had the disclosures are the same as for TCFD, and that was deliberate in order to support integration in the future of your nature and climate work. And we've also recently put out some draft guidance on nature transition plans that also use the same structure as climate transition planning guidance, or the best practice in the market. So again, trying to support that integration. Climate and nature are two sides of the same coin. Climate change is a driver of nature loss, and the effects of climate change are, in our framework, manifestations of changes in nature, changes in the atmosphere, changes in environmental systems. So it's all part of the same picture. When you're doing an intervention for climate, we'd suggest that you think about whether this is affecting any of the other 5 drivers of nature change. So, 4 drivers. So climate change is one driver, but also pollution, land, ocean, freshwater use change, resource use, and invasive alien species. Are you affecting any of those other drivers of nature loss through your intervention on climate? You could also start to try and look at the state of nature in the locations. So the Nature Positive Initiative has brought out a consultation on state of nature metrics. So what is the condition of the ecosystem that you're operating in? And you can start to think about whether your climate intervention is affecting that in any way. And then on the second point about long value chains, so obviously where the impact is, that's super easy in a sense. You've done the hard bit, and you can start to make that work. Working with others, we definitely would support that, obviously within the law as is possible. I mentioned certification as one way you could do that, sort of indirectly in a sense. But again, collaborating to the extent possible is definitely a way forward in managing these risks. And there's the transition planning guidance that we put out, again, includes some on how you can do that, sort of the types of initiatives that you can work with others in the industry across your value chain and in specific locations to start to drive forward change. And we definitely recognise that's a really important part of the picture. But Charlie, do you have some more to add on that point?
Sure. Yeah, I thought it would just be helpful to talk a little bit about what we've seen in some of the early reports. So some of the companies that have been going through exactly what you're talking about, Kanishk, and saying, you know, what can we really do about this? One of the things that I take away from it that I find really interesting is the companies that have decided to look at value chains and at that stage, because also recognize that, you know, what the TNFD framework and guidance is asking for is like a long-term view. So it's not saying everyone immediately has to have value chains completely sorted. This is a journey that you get to over time. But those companies that are looking at it, they're saying, okay, so I have a view on these are my most important commodities. I think these types of suppliers that I'm working with are probably where I should focus on. And it's going to be really hard for me to get to really granular, like exact location and asset locations, supply chain data. So what can I do already today? And the two things that I see a lot of companies doing is, number one, saying, how can I improve that data landscape? And so what they're doing is trying to think and organize amongst themselves in the same way many industries did for Scope 3 to say, let's together as an industry decide what are our 1, 2, 3 hotspots, and then have a common view on what we're going out and asking suppliers for, because I think everyone got really burned in a lot of climate and Scope 3 stuff with a lot of extra burden put on suppliers where it wasn't necessarily productive. So people are trying to avoid that. So they're saying, let's coordinate first, all agree on our priorities together before we go out and engage the supply chain. So that's the one thing they're doing. The second thing is exactly what you said, which is in a market where there's not huge transparency and there are many tiers to the supply chain, how can we work to bring up the minimum standards of the industry as a whole, especially if you know it's coming from a specific area? So that particularly links into companies that are affected by EUDR, because there's generally certification schemes and supply chain initiatives already set up around some of these high risk commodities. So short answer there, Kanishk, is definitely that's something that you want to be looking into if you're struggling with transparency. And I think investors will respond to and say, yes, we appreciate the fact that you're working on that. Because again, that's another thing to say, you know, TNFD doesn't decide, you know, what's good and what's bad. TNFD is just providing recommendations for transparency, and ultimately it's investors and other stakeholders that are reading these reports and, you know, assessing the action each company is taking. But certainly I see lots of companies doing exactly what you said. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, really helpful.
Appreciate.
Yeah. Emma.
Hi. Yeah, I just want to follow on from Kanish's point about copper, because I thought it was quite a helpful one. So I might just and I appreciate your point there, Charlie, that you're helping with transparency, not necessarily the absolute how. So I've probably been really unfair asking you this. So it's more around advice really, but just playing this out in a worst case scenario. So let's just say you've got 10 levels in your supply chain. Let's say I'm level 1, the customer in this case, or the person that sells to the consumer, and you've got level 10, which is your mine, let's say. We've been having discussions around this anyway, but we were kind of thinking, if it makes sense, let's say for level 5 in the middle, to be the ones that certify and get the standards. So in essence, level 5 to 10 are really implementing and doing the change. And really all that levels 1 to 5 are doing are just making sure that that change happens and reporting up the chain, in short. So you've got actors that just do the reporting. In your mind, is that going to be sufficient to prove that levels 1 to 5 have had an impact on levels 5 to 10, but are not doing the implementing, but they have created a reporting mechanism to get that data up the chain? Is that going to be sufficient? Because I think that's where we all get a bit sort of tied up, really, is thinking that each person has to do some sort of action in the supply chain, and sometimes it just doesn't make sense for the person at the end to get that involved, really.
No, absolutely. I think that's very sensible. I think if you can, yeah, if you're so far down the value chain that you can't access the information upstream, but you can get a good sense of what's going on through what's reported to you by someone a couple of tiers up, and you're happy that that is sufficient for you to have a good understanding of the likely issues, and your investors are happy with that, I don't necessarily see that as a problem. And as Charlie has said, that's already something that's happening. And certainly the food supply chain is what I'm more familiar with. But if you think about palm oil, soya certification, obviously there are problems with these initiatives, but essentially, if you're a small player and you don't have capacity to do your own tracing, that is a really good way of trying to get a handle on your nature-related issues and trying to manage them. And I think it's perfectly a reasonable way to do so.
Okay.
Well, one thing I would add just on that is, so again, the language came up there. Is this sufficient? Is this okay? And it's a really interesting perspective. So again, I just want to implore, it's not TNFD's position to say this is sufficient, this is good practice, this is not good practice. It's just TNFD is just creating the recommendations, the guidance that's supposed to improve transparency. So really, when you're asking, is this sufficient? You're asking, will my investors think this is sufficient? Will my stakeholders think this is sufficient? So that's the question that you really have to ask yourself. So if you look at your value chain and you think, okay, I think I could be connected to these impacts, but I see my level 5 supplier going through the certification process. I think if you're happy that that covers this and you can make a credible case around that to your stakeholders, then yeah, 100% that box is ticked. But if there are things that you're thinking, actually, I still have some concerns around this, those are the things that you might want to even actually think about and disclose, because you're essentially then being entirely fully transparent and saying, this, we've done everything that we can within our power, but here's some concerns which we want to raise, but you know, we're looking for ways to work with that. One other reflection that I have on kind of what those companies that are really far downstream potentially do is there are some interesting partnerships that have come up in certain industries to help try and improve conditions and transitions further up the supply chain. So the example that comes to my mind is in the UK, Tesco is working with Santander to provide essentially preferential financing to help its farmers switch to regen ag, which both help their climate and their nature goals. And so that's an example where, like, Tesco isn't necessarily actually paying. Santander's offering preferential rates, so they're getting better outcomes for their farmers from a financial perspective. Tesco's helping meet their climate and nature targets, and from Santander's perspective, it actually makes them a more responsible and more secure company to lend to. So they actually get benefit from their financing. So it's no direct payment to their upstream suppliers, but they're helping them transition nonetheless. So that's something that you can maybe think about. Could something like that apply to my situation if you're a large enough company to think about that? But there's some interesting partnership things happening in this space.
Excellent. Great stuff, Charlie. Christian.
Yeah, I hope sound is clear.
Yeah, good.
Just good news to me to hear that this type of tier 4 assessment of sourcing schemes and standards is appreciated, because I think that is a very important feature. And to me, from the practice I have, at least with the aluminium industry, it's far more important to know what is done, where it's done, rather than to know where it's done. This type of overemphasis on spatial disaggregation typically invites our, let's say, best education to judge whether there is a problem or not, which might not necessarily relate to the situation that we have on site. And in addition, this type of certification standards that tell us how management should look like, where, for example, bauxite is mined, that also then allows to talk about the communities and community engagement. And it invites, let's say, also the human and societal component into sourcing decisions and management decisions. An extremely strong feature that you get by sourcing standards that you typically don't get if you just get this spatial traceability going, where you just have a country or a whatever guest situation. And so to me, there is even more value and positive collaterals going with performance standards, as long as they meet the targets that we would all articulate on biodiversity maintenance.
Yeah, I mean, location is always going to be important for nature, and you do need to think about location. There's no getting away from that. I think what we're just saying is that when you're thinking about trying to measure nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities, you might secondary data for a lower level of geographical specificity might be sufficient for you to understand what the issues are likely to be in the locations that actually exist, even if you don't know what those locations specifically are at any one point. But again, that balance is a judgment, and as Charlie said, it also depends on what the demands of your investors are. But I wouldn't want to give the impression that we don't think location is important. Location is incredibly important. You can't get away from location when you're thinking about nature.
Yeah. Brilliant. Stephanie.
Sorry, I'm building on the conversation, if you don't mind, Oli.
That's the point. Well done.
Yeah, on this notion of third-party verification, I have two kind of questions, comments here, is whether or not TNFD is planning to shortlist or give criteria to identify what is a credible sustainable verification schemes. Because you have a lot, and I'm sure you've seen some reports back 10 years ago already stating the number of seals and labels you have on the market, but they are not all as credible as they may want to be. So how would you assess us? I mean, for sure, we all want to use this third-party verification. I'm also aligned with what Christian you were saying. So the location is indeed important. But will you have a judgment, let's say, or how the framework will look into that? One thing. The second is about data. When you look into this third-party verification, they assess that what is done in the field is correctly done and sustainably done against their principles. Some of them that are linked to the ISIL Alliance, they will, and they are committed to deliver what we call an M&E report of their schemes. So to what extent the application of their schemes in the field is creating a change. So what we call the theory of change, okay? And I'm getting to the data point. How have you been engaging with these schemes owner or these umbrella association like ISIL Alliance to understand what types of data are generated by the users of these schemes in the field, and to what extent they can become primary or secondary data, because they will do it with not necessarily the same perspectives than we will need them as a secondary or tertiary user of the data. So I just wanted you to be aware of this is already existing, and if you have not reached out to them, then do please go and fast, because they have been working in this field for the last 25 years, and they have a lot of experience in terms of transforming action in the field. And what they lack, and this is why they are really much supportive of the TNFD and the SBTN, is that upscale. If everyone that this kind of third-party verification become the market and not just the differentiator anymore. So yeah, that's kind of a comment sharing.
Yeah, good points.
Yeah, so we are aware of ISIL, and we're commenting on something they were doing just the other day. So, but we need to check in how much we have talked to them. But certainly, we're definitely aware of their work. We're not going to be providing any particular endorsements of any particular certification schemes. That's again for you to form judgment on what you need and what any particular scheme is providing. What we are doing is looking at how data is shared up and down the value chain and how we can help improve that. So one of the initiatives we're looking at is we're calling the value chain passport. And as I mentioned earlier, this is sort of standardize how data is shared up and down the value chain, so that you don't have it's automatically shared tier by tier, and so that you have access to the full chain going up in a more sort of consistent, structured way. But it's still very much at the conceptualization stage of how that might work, what would be useful, what's the role of TNFD in that system. So very early days, but we're not.
If you have anything on the value chain passport, it's the first time I'm hearing it, so I'm happy to receive any whatever public documents that you may have. And are you working, and I hope you are, with a Nature Positive initiative that they've been...
members, yeah.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to stop it there. Just Tom, huge thanks, because I know you were parachuted in a bit, so I really appreciate it, and to also help from Charlie as well, and just to everyone here. Just very, very quickly, it looks like climate and nature are intertwined, so I'm sure we'll have a four-way meeting between the Scope 3 peer group, the nature peer group, the Scope 3 chapter, and the nature chapter of the SPP at some point in the future, inevitably. Just keep in touch. Emma, any big moments coming up for you for the chapter that you want to quickly say?
No, I think we're going to pause now until after Christmas, but we've got quite
really?
a lot of things.
It's weeks left. What are you doing?
I know. Well, everyone's running around trying to get things wrapped up end of
Christmas
year.
presents.
So
Yeah.
we didn't want to take well, not quite Christmas presents. I imagine just wrapping up work and stuff. It's always a bit of a push, isn't it? Just get to the end of the year and do all your budgets for next year. So we'll come in swinging. We've got we're doing something with Irma and a mining company in January. I think it'll be 3rd or 4th week of January. So that would be very exciting. So talking about the Irma certification and also touching upon the responsible steel initiative as well. But then we're inviting people from different parts of the supply chain to come and sort of talk about their experience as to how they've been able to implement it and some of the watch outs as well. So that should be exciting. So we've got that coming.
Superb.
Just to plug in, if you wanted to keep updated as to what events are coming, as Emma has just highlighted, just join the LinkedIn group, and there's also resources that we share there on a regular basis.
Yeah, search for SPP Nature on LinkedIn and you'll find it, definitely. And the Nature Peer Group is having another meeting because we work right up until the end. So on the 10th of December, there will be a business case for nature clinic as well, a bit like this one, purely focused on that. So you're very, very welcome to that. And just, stay in touch, guys, and connect with each other. We're all just working it out as we go along, obviously. But huge thanks for everyone to put that together. It was really good fun. Cheers. Have a good week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Cheers, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
It's all right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.